Did you know that one of the biggest rap record labels was started in New York? I'm sure you did. That's no surprise there. But did you know a rap record wasn't even their first release? Hip-hop powerhouse Def Jam Recordings, aka Def Jam, known for classic hip-hop acts like Public Enemy and LL Cool J, as well as newer ones like Logic and YG, started in the early 80s by co-founders Rick Rubin and Russell Simmons. The former was part of the band Hose, which would also be the first ones to release music on the label. Tila Rock and DJ Jazzy J, LL Cool J, and the Beastie Boys were the first ones to release rap singles on the label, however, with the tracks It's Yours, I Need a Beat, and Rock Hard, respectively. According to Rick Rubin, DJ Jazzy J was the one who introduced him to Russell, who at that point had been managing the group Run DMC, composed of his brother Joseph Simmons, aka Run, DJ Jam Master J, and Daryl McDaniels, aka DMC. Russell joined Rick as a business partner due to his experience in the rap business already, and together they continued to release music by various rappers and other artists. After the success of those singles, Def Jam acquired a distribution deal with Columbia Records and continued to release singles like Jazzy J's Def Jam and Jimmy Spicer's This Is It, and also released their first full-length LP, LL Cool J's Radio, in November 1985, which was produced entirely by Rick Rubin, minus a track produced by Jazzy J. Then in February 1986, they released the debut album by singer Orange Juice Jones titled Juice, which featured the hit single, The Rain, a classic track. Just like with Rick Rubin's first release, Def Jam didn't only do rap music, they also had several subsidiaries as they grew bigger, so keep in mind, if I just say Def Jam, it might include those as well. The first of those would be OBR, or Original Black Recordings, which was an R&B focused branch and signed artists like Orange Juice Jones. Later that year, they also released the albums Chasing a Dream by Tashawn, Rain in Blood by the metal band Slayer, and the debut studio album by the Beastie Boys, Licensed to Ill. Licensed to Ill would later go on to become a diamond-selling album. For those that don't know, Diamond is a certification for 10 million units sold. Not many rap albums have achieved that, but artists like Tupac, Eminem, Biggie, and Outkast are among the first. That next year, in 1987, things started off with a rush, or rather the album Yo Bum Rush the Show, the debut album by Public Enemy. That was followed up by the second album by LL Cool J, Bigger and Deffer, which was definitely bigger if we're talking commercially, as the album went double platinum and is his highest selling album, no doubt partly due to the hit single I Need Love, which would be the beginning of his streak of love songs. Speaking of love songs, also in '87, they released the albums The Finer Things in Life by Chuck Stanley and Orange Juice Jones' second album, GTO, Gangsters Taking Over. That's a tough name for an R&B album. Also, Davey D released his debut album, Davey's Ride, and the soundtrack to the film, Less Than Zero, was released as well, which includes the hit single, Going Back to Cali by LL. During this time, another person joined the fray of the record executives at Def Jam, that being Lyor Cohen. He started off promoting shows and found himself working for Russell's Rush Productions company, then eventually became the president of Def Jam in 1988. Rick and Lyor had disagreements regarding the label, which resulted in Rubin leaving to start his own record label company again, leaving Russell and Lyor as essentially the new business partners of Def Jam. The label Rubin started was called Def American before later being changed to American Recordings. That label had a focus more on metal and country, but still had a few rap releases such as the Ghetto Boys. On the music side, however, Def Jam released a few albums in 1988. One of those being the debut and only album by the group Original Concept, which includes Dr. Dre. No, not the one that made the Chronic album, but the one who went on to become the co-host for Yo MTV Raps. The album was titled Straight from the Basement with Cooley High. They also released Slayer's fourth album, South of Heaven. Afterwards, Slayer would move with Rick Rubin to his new label. Two classic rap albums were also released as well. Firstly, Public Enemy's second album, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. Considered by some to be one of the best rap albums of the golden era of hip-hop, with classic tracks like Black Steel in the Hour of Chaos and Rebel Without a Pause. Secondly was The Great Adventures of Slick Rick, the debut album by Slick Rick, which featured hit singles like Children's Story and Teenage Love. Not a year full of releases for the label, but I'd say it was a pretty successful one just off the strength of the quality of those albums. Both Public Enemies and Slick Rick's went platinum as well. Children's Story remains one of the best storytelling songs in rap today. If you haven't seen my video on the saddest storytelling songs in rap, go check it out. Largely due to that album, Slick Rick would be known as one of the greatest storytellers in hip-hop. The next year, 1989, Def Jam came back with a few more non-rap albums. Singer Allison Williams with her debut album Raw, Philadelphia group Blue Magic with their 8th album From Out of the Blue, New Kirk's new funk album, and Orange Juice Jones with his 3rd and final album on the label, To Be Immortal. This also saw the debut of rap group 3rd Base with the Cactus album, which is known for the track Gas Face, as the first official record featuring the veteran MC MF Doom, who at the time was rapping under the name Zev Love X. Also, MC Search from the group is known as one of the first people to put Nas on a record and served as the executive producer for his debut album, Illmatic. Last but not least, they had the release of LL Cool J's 3rd album, Walking with a Panther. The album featured hit singles like I'm That Type of Guy and Going Back to Cali. The cassette version also featured the track Jack the Ripper, one of the diss tracks LL directed towards Kool Moe Dee. I've also covered that beef on the channel, so for more details with that, go check out the video after this. The album was a commercial success, so great for Def Jam, but with the continuation of the female-oriented songs, it left some fans questioning LL's rap ability. LL was a premier artist for Def Jam though, as labels care about sales, and that's what he was able to do. At the turn of the decade, things got fired up with the release of Public Enemy's 3rd album, Fear of a Black Planet, which included classic tracks like Burn Hollywood Burn that took aim at the stereotypical portrayal of black people in film, and 911 is a Joke, the Flavor Flav track that lampooned the 911 emergency services. Of course, you can't forget the phenomenal track Fight the Power, which was first released back in 1989 and is well known for being in the soundtrack to the Spike Lee film Do the Right Thing. It's one of the standout tracks in rap as a whole and one of my personal favorites. It was also nominated for a Grammy as well. I've talked about it more in my video about police brutality songs in rap. Once again, if you haven't seen it yet, check it out after this. Like LL Cool J, Public Enemy was another one of the biggest artists for Def Jam, but much more controversial as they were considered pro-black or Afrocentric with their message, which you could imagine wouldn't be nearly as wide-reaching or well-received by the media or public. For every star that the label had, there were even more artists that released an album or a single and were done with the label for whatever reason. Now, this isn't something specific to Def Jam, of course. It's happened with plenty of labels. You could say it's the nature of the industry. Also in 1990, they released the debut and only albums by the groups No Face with their album Wake Your Daughter Up, and the Afros with their album Kickin' Afrolistics. Allison Williams also had a remix album released titled Cooked, which featured different versions of various songs from her first album, Raw. They also released the Cactus Revisited, which has several remixed tracks from the Cactus album. LL Cool J came with his 4th album, Mama Said Knock You Out, which included one of his most well-known hits, that being the title track, which also won him the first of his 2 Grammys. The album also featured other hit singles like Around the Way Girl and The Boomin' System, as well as the diss track To the Break of Dawn, where LL dissed Kool Moe Dee, MC Hammer, and Ice-T. On top of that, they released the 3rd album by rap duo EPMD, Business as Usual, which included the debut of Redman on the tracks Hardcore and Brothers on My Jock. Redman would then go on to release several albums on the label himself. Russell Simmons would also around this time create Rush Associated Labels, which would essentially be the parent company for some other smaller labels. As the term says, quite literally, labels associated with Russell Simmons. For the sake of simplicity, however, I will still be referring to all the albums as Def Jam releases. That being said, in 1991, they released several more albums than previously, partly due to record label changes. Rap duos Downtown Science and BWP, or Bitches with Problems, released their debut albums, the former being self-titled and the latter titled The Bitches. Also, the solo albums by rappers Nikki D and The Don, titled Daddy's Little Girl and Wake Up the Party, respectively. Terminator X, the DJ from Public Enemy, also released his solo debut album as well, titled Terminator X and the Valley of the Jeep Beats. Singers Lizette Melendez and Sunday released their debut albums titled Together Forever and Only Time Will Tell, respectively. Def Jam also released the soundtrack for the film Living Large. The albums don't stop there though. Third Base released their second and final album, Derelicts of Dialect, before breaking up. Slick Rick released his second album, The Ruler's Back, which didn't perform as well as his debut and was recorded while he was out on bail before going back to prison. Like I mentioned previously, certain releases came due to label changes, one of those being Nice and Smooth, who along with EPMD came from the label Fresh Records and now were signed to Def Jam. The first album they released on the label was their second album overall, titled Ain't a Damn Thing Changed. Last but not least, they also released a fourth album by Public Enemy, Apocalypse 91, The Enemy Strikes Black, which like their previous two albums, also went platinum. It was a pretty busy year for releases, and you might say that things were going pretty good for the label, and as far as the sheer amount of albums released, you could say so, but more on that later. Now the year was 1992, and something else occurred. They had a bit more competition in the rap game. Newly founded Cash Money Records released their first album and became a force to be reckoned with over the years. You could check out my video on the rise of Cash Money Records for more details on that. Also in the West was the newly founded Death Row Records releasing albums like Dr. Dre's The Chronic. Now back to Def Jam. Allison Williams released her self-titled album, her second and final on the label, or third counting the remix album. The group's family and Total Look and The Style released their first and only albums on the label, titled Runs in the Family and Do Some Damage, respectively. On the rap side of things, a greatest hits album by Public Enemy was released, titled Greatest Misses, I presume due to it not featuring their hits, which is what greatest hits albums typically do. Pretty unconventional, but hey, leave it to Public Enemy to do just that. I ain't mad at it. The album featured a mix of unreleased tracks and remixes of tracks from previous albums and eventually went gold. Also, EPMD released their fourth album and second on the label, Business Never Personal, which once again received critical acclaim, but unfortunately would be their last album for a while due to the duo breaking up. MC Search from Third Base also released his solo debut titled Return of the Product, which featured the track Back to the Grill. This would be the track that featured Nas that I mentioned earlier. Ironically enough, the first track Nas was featured on was Main Source's Live at the Barbecue, released a year prior. The song names are too similar to not assume it was intentional. Also, another Def Jam star would release his debut. Jersey's own Redman released What? The Album, considered a classic album and one of Redman's best, and also went on to be certified gold as well. In 1993, the group Onyx, comprised of Fredo Starr, his cousin Sticky Fingers, Sonny Steeza, and Big DS, released their debut album, Back the Fuck Up, on Def Jam, or rather, Jam Master Jay Records. Like I said before, there were multiple labels under Def Jam, and his was one of them. The album went platinum and included hit songs like Slam and Throw Your Guns. That same day, LL Cool J's fifth album, 14 Shots to the Dome, was released as well and eventually went gold, his worst performing album up to that point. Pete Nice and DJ Richie Rich, the other two members of Third Base, had put out their own album titled Dust to Dust after their separation from MC Search. Detroit rapper Boss released their debut album, Born Gangsters, as a part of the newly formed Def Jam West. Although Detroit is more like the Midwest, but everything is West compared to New York, so hey, I'm rolling with it. Also, as EPMD had recently broken up, Eric Sermon, the E and EPMD, released his solo debut album, No Pressure, that year as well. Then rapper Domino, from the Bloods and Crips rap group, released his solo debut self-titled album, which also went gold. Then in 1994, despite several albums going gold and platinum, Def Jam ran into financial troubles, and Polyground Records wound up purchasing 50% of Def Jam, and the distribution changed. Basically, more record label shuffling. Nonetheless, the albums continued to roll out. Lisette Melendez released her second album, True to Life, which would also be her last on the label. LA rap group South Central Cartel would release their second album through the label as well, titled And Gats We Trust. By this time in rap, New York didn't have a chokehold on it like it had in the 80s. As you can see, more and more West Coast artists were getting signed to major record labels and gaining recognition. One in particular made a big contribution to Def Jam, that being Warren G, Dr. Dre's stepbrother and member of the rap group 213 with Snoop Dogg and Nate Dogg. Unlike the rest of the crew, he signed to Violator Management instead of Death Row and had his album distributed by Def Jam. Warren G released his debut album, Regulate G-Funk Era, this year, featuring classic songs like This DJ and Regulate, as well as my favorite one, Do You See. The album quickly went on to go double platinum, the label's most commercially successful album of the year. Nice and Smooth released their third album, Jewel of the Nile, as well, which would also be their last album on the label. Speaking of third albums, Slick Rick also had his third album released this year, Behind Bars, which, as you might presume, is a reference to the fact that he was indeed in prison for the release of the album. It didn't perform as well as his previous two, however, possibly in part due to this fact. Public Enemy released their fifth album, Music in Our Message, which featured the hit single Give It Up. The album went gold but didn't perform as well as their previous three albums, which went platinum and were critically acclaimed. Another well-known Def Jam star released their debut album this year, that being the breakout member of the Wu-Tang Clan, Method Man, with the platinum selling to Cal, which would also be the first solo album released from Wu-Tang Clan since the group first formed and released their debut album the year prior. Redman released his second album also, There Is a Dark Side, which is another fan favorite, and like the previous album, also went gold. The rap group Flatliners, considered one of the first horrorcore groups, released their debut album as well, titled USA, meaning Under Satan's Authority. That would be the group's only release on the label as they were dropped, probably due to the album not performing well. Not exactly surprising, as horrorcore is a pretty controversial subgenre of rap. One of the members of the group was Red Rum, who is a nephew of Russell and his brother Run. I guess business and family don't really mix, as they say. The group YNV released their self-titled debut and soul album this year, as well as rapper LaRocco T releasing his debut album, Hold On Tight. Another year full of releases as well as record label shuffling, and the early 90s focus on West Coast music and gangsta rap as a whole. This was also the year that two other classic albums were released in New York, Nas's debut album Illmatic and Biggie's debut album Ready to Die. Imagine if those two were also part of the label's catalog. What do you think? Would Nas and Biggie have the success that they had if they were Def Jam artists back then, instead of Nas being on Columbia and Biggie being on Bad Boy? Moving on to 1995, a bunch of albums yet again, starting with SCC presents Murder Squad Nationwide, the SCC meaning South Central Cartel, essentially the group's third album. However, it heavily featured other artists on it. Then Montel Jordan, most well known for his hit single, This Is How We Do It, released his debut album of the same name, and both the album and single went platinum. Once again, this was another year where West Coast artists were rising, and Def Jam was definitely still branching out, as besides those albums, they also released several others from the West. R&B trio Moken Steph released their debut and only album titled As Is, once again another one and done from an R&B group. The brothers BG Knockout and Dresta from the iconic diss track Real Motherfucking G's released their debut album as well, titled Real Brothers, which featured the diss track DPGK, or Dog Pound Gangsta Killer, a diss track of course to the Dog Pound and their crew in general. For more on that diss track and the beef between Death Row Records and Ruthless Records, check out my video on it on the channel after this. The rap group The Dove Shack released their debut album as well, titled This Is The Shack, which is named after one of the tracks from Warren G's Regulate album, which they were featured on. Like I said previously, West Coast music was definitely in at the time, so lots of artists from the area were being signed. It continues on with the rap duo Twins releasing their debut album, Conversation, almost entirely produced by Warren G. Once again, it's a West Coast connection. Rapper Mello also released his debut and soul album titled It's a BG Thing, Life of a Youngster, and J.O. Felony released his debut album, Take a Ride. California was heavy with the album releases in '95 thanks to G-Funk albums like Dr. Dre's Chronic and Snoop Dogg's Doggy Style in the early 90s. Def Jam brought it back home to New York though in the tail end of the year with releases by classic acts like Onyx, LL Cool J, and Eric Sermon. Onyx released their second album, All We Got Is Us, which didn't perform as well as their previous one but still managed to go gold. LL released his sixth album, Mr. Smith, which was considered more up to par with his albums before 14 Shots to the Dome, and went double platinum. As he said on Mama Said Knock You Out, don't call it a comeback, he's been here for years. Eric Sermon released his second solo album, Double or Nothing, which heavily featured Keith Murray and Redman, members of the group Def Squad that Eric formed after EPMD broke up. Reggae artist CAPLETON also released his first album on the label and 5th overall, titled Prophecy. Then in 1996, the year started off with Domino releasing his second album, Physical Funk. Def Jam also released a Nutty Professor soundtrack this year, which went platinum. R&B group Code 3 also released their self-titled debut album. Singer Case released his self-titled debut album as well, featuring the hit single Touch Me Tease Me. Montel Jordan released his second album shortly afterwards, and as it goes with several other artists and their sophomore albums, didn't perform as well commercially, but did go gold. Oakland rapper Richie Rich, known for featuring on a few of Tupac's albums, including one of my favorite Pac songs from his All Eyes on Me album, released his third album and major label debut titled Seasoned Veteran on Def Jam, which also featured Tupac on one of the tracks. A Greatest Hits album by LL Cool J was also released, featuring his hit singles from all of his albums leading up to that point. Foxy Brown, who had previously appeared on LL Cool J's Mr. Smith album on the remix for I Shot Ya, as well as on Case's Touch Me Tease Me and Jay-Z's Ain't No Nigga, had built up a name for herself at this point and released her debut album Il Nana that year as well, going platinum and breaking records as a female rapper. Flesh and Bone, older brother of Lazy Bone and fellow member of Bone Thugs and Harmony, released his solo debut THUGS, or Thugs, that year as well. Then there was Redman with his third album, Muddy Waters, which, like his previous two albums, is considered one of his best and also went gold as well. Rapper Suge released his album 86 The Madness as well on the label, wrapping up 1996, another year full of many releases through various sublabels. The label opened up 1997 with the release of Warren G's second album, Take a Look Over Your Shoulder. Once again, the sophomore album didn't perform as well commercially as the debut, but still went gold. South Central Cartel's third album on the label and 4th overall, All Day Every Day, was released next, which would also be their last album distributed through the label. Rap group Crew released their debut and soul album as well, titled 30, which featured the single Just Another Case, which features Slick Rick and samples lines from his own hit single Children's Story. Then, like they did for previous films, Def Jam released the soundtrack for the film Def Jam's How to Be a Player, which of course featured tracks by several Def Jam artists. This year, Eric Sermon and Parrish got back together to form EPMD again and released their 5th album, the aptly named Back in Business, which, like all their previous albums, also wound up going gold. Then LL Cool J released his 7th album, Phenomenon, featuring the track 4321, which was the start of the LL Cool J and Cannabis beef, which I've covered on the channel as well, so make sure to check it out later if you haven't for more details. Shortly afterwards, the debut and soul album by the rap group The Firm was released. The group, featuring Nas, AZ, Foxy Brown, and Cormega, who was replaced by Nature for the album, released the self-titled album through Dr. Dre's Aftermath Entertainment and Interscope Records. But considering Foxy Brown was a part of the group, Violator Management and Def Jam had something to do with the release probably. Also, Cormega was signed to Def Jam as well after his feature on Nas' second album, It Was Written, which was released a year prior. Also in 97, Def Jam acquired 50% of Rockefeller Records and released Jay-Z's second album, In My Lifetime Volume 1. You know how I've mentioned a few sophomore slump albums, as they call it? Well, Jay-Z was one of the rare exceptions around this time. In My Lifetime was the first of several albums of his released through Def Jam that went platinum. Shortly afterwards, the R&B duo Christian, that was signed to Rockefeller, released their debut album, Ghetto Serrano, featuring the hit song Full of Smoke. It's a classic song to me. I heard it quite a few times at home growing up. The reggae artist CAPLETON released his next album, I Testament, on the label as well. Sometime during the year, Def Jam signed DMX as well, which would lead to them having a pretty good year thanks to his work ethic. In 1998, DMX accomplished a feat that only one other rapper at the time ever managed to do until that point, that being Tupac, with releasing 2 #1 albums within a year. Tupac did that feat with his 4th and 5th albums, All Eyes on Me and Machiavelli, The 7 Day Theory, respectively, which both released in 1996, and DMX did it with his first 2 albums, which I'll be getting to in a minute. In 1998, the R&B group Playa released their debut album, Cheers to You, through Def Soul, which was established in 1996, and was the branch releasing albums from artists like Montel Jordan, Case, and more. Speaking of which, Montel Jordan released his 3rd album as well, titled Let's Ride, which like his previous effort, didn't match his debut album but still achieved gold status. 2 more soundtracks were released as well. He Got Game for the Spike Lee film, which also served as a Public Enemy album essentially as they were behind a majority of the album, and Streets is Watching. Then in May 1998, DMX released his first album, It's Dark and Hell is Hot, which is one of my favorite rap albums of all time and considered a classic by many. It went 4 times platinum and featured hit singles like Rough Riders Anthem and Get At Me Dog. The intro on the album is what I consider one of the best intros for any rap album I've ever heard. 6 months later, he would come back and release his second album, but plenty of albums released in between then. One such album being Onyx's third, Shut 'Em Down, which features the single React that is known as being one of the first officially released recordings by up-and-coming rapper 50 Cent, who like Onyx was signed to Jam Master Jay's JMJ Records. Later that month, Def Squad released their debut album, El Nino, the only one they released as a group, and it quickly went gold. It was followed up by J.O. Felony's second album, What You Gonna Do, which would be his last album released through the label. Then yet another soundtrack was released, this time for the film Rush Hour, which was another platinum seller. In the late 90s, you could say New York rap was making a resurgence in the mainstream, largely due to rappers like DMX and Jay-Z releasing albums going multi-platinum and bringing in millions, especially the Def Jam. Jay released his third album, Volume 2, Hard Knock Life, which eventually went 5 times platinum and would be his most commercially successful album, no doubt largely due to the platinum-selling hit single, Hard Knock Life. This would also be his first #1 album and also won him his first Grammy, although at the time he was boycotting the Grammys, so he didn't attend. Then once again, wouldn't you know it, yet another classic film was released with a soundtrack by Def Jam. This time it was Belly, the acting debut of Nas and DMX, and also features fellow rapper Method Man, as well as appearances from other artists. Speaking of Method Man, his album came next. 4 years after his debut album Tikal, came Tikal 2000 Judgment Day, which like his debut album also went platinum. After Meth came Red with his 4th album, Doc's the Name 2000. It wasn't even 1999 yet and they were releasing albums with 2000 in the title. The album featured the single, I'll Be That. If you don't know the song, go check out the video, you might get a laugh or two. This album, unlike his previous ones, went platinum instead of gold. DJ Clue then released his debut album, The Professional, which featured tracks from several high-profile artists at the time such as Nas, Jay-Z, and DMX. To wrap up the year, DMX released his second album, Flesh of My Flesh, Blood of My Blood, which like his first album released 6 months prior, also was a #1 album and also went multi-platinum. It features the single Slippin', which is a song you really have to experience for yourself if you haven't heard it yet. Certified classic DMX track. Also during this year, the company Seagram purchased Polygram, which had purchased the majority of Def Jam, so once again, more record label shuffling. Def Jam had now merged with several other labels owned by the company and became the Island Def Jam Music Group. Once again, for the sake of simplicity, I'll still be using the name Def Jam, however. Then in 1999, Russell Simmons sold the remaining 40% of Def Jam as well for $100 million, and Lear Cohen was named the president of the Island Def Jam Group. Record executive Kevin Liles was then the new president of Def Jam. Release-wise, the year had several releases from established artists as well as some new heavy hitters. Foxy Brown started things off with her second album, China Doll, which like her debut, Il Nana, also went platinum. Case then released his second album, Personal Conversation, which like his debut also went gold. It features the hit single, Happily Ever After, which was also the first official video appearance by Beyonce. Slick Rick came with his 4th and final album, The Art of Storytelling, giving his penchant for storytelling tracks the name fits. On the album is the single Street Talkin' featuring Outkast, which is one of my favorite Slick Rick songs. Shortly afterwards, another future hit-making Def Jam star made his appearance. Ja Rule from Murder Inc., the recently formed label by Irv and Chris Gotti under Def Jam, released his debut album, Veni Vidi Vici, featuring the hit single Holla Holla, which received a remix featuring Jay-Z, Vita, Cadillac Ta, Memphis Bleak, Black Child, and Busta Rhymes. This would begin a streak of platinum-selling albums, during which this time he was involved in a high-profile beef with up-and-coming rapper 50 Cent. That beef has been covered on the channel as well. Then the band Biohazard released their 4th album, New World Disorder, through Mercury Records, which through their label mergers became a release through Island Def Jam. EPMD then released their 5th album, Out of Business, an aptly named title considering it was their last release on Def Jam, and they wouldn't release another album together for several years as they had broken up a second time. Also, Greek comedy duo Cumbria, can't even pronounce that word, I'm not even gonna try that again, released their fourth album, 2030. Jay-Z protege and fellow Marcy Project resident Memphis Bleek released his debut album after featuring on Jay-Z's first few albums, in particular on Reasonable Doubt on the track Coming of Age, as that is also the title of his debut album, which featured the single Memphis Bleek Is, which is considered by some to be a diss to Nas, who had a few months prior released a single titled Nas Is Like. At the time, Jay-Z and Nas were beefing, and that was a part of the overall issue. That beef has been covered as well on the channel, so check it out after this for more details. Coming of Age quickly went gold, probably due to the anticipation built up due to him being featured on Jay-Z's albums and being signed to Rockefeller. Violator Records soon released a compilation album titled Violator, the album, which of course features songs from several Violator artists and others, including the hit single Vibrant Thing by Q-Tip. Also this year, the duo of Method Man and Redman released their debut album, Blackout, featuring the single The Rockwilder, named after the song's producer Rockwilder, and is another classic rap track and favorite to me. Like some of their solo efforts up until this point, the album also went platinum. Very few R&B releases this year from the label, but there was one that performed quite well in particular. Cisco, the lead singer from Dru Hill, released his solo debut album, Unleash the Dragon, which featured the hit singles Donk Song, Incomplete, and Got to Get It. The album went 5 times platinum eventually and got multiple Grammy nominations. DJs Funkmaster Flex and Big Cap released the album The Tunnel, also on the label, which went on to go gold. Last but certainly not least, DMX and Jay-Z released their third and fourth albums respectively. DMX released And Then There Was X, which features the hit singles What's My Name and Party Up, 2 of his most well-known tracks, as well as What These Bitches Want, which features Cisco. Like his previous 2, this album went multi-platinum as well. Jay-Z's fourth album, Volume 3, Life and Times of S. Carter, became another one of his most commercially successful albums, going triple platinum, and includes the hit single Big Pimpin' featuring UGK, one of his biggest singles up to that point. Also in 1999, another label was started, that being Def Jam South, which would see the rise of one of rap's biggest stars from that region, Ludacris. Like the rise of West Coast rap in the late 80s to early 90s, Southern rap was now becoming bigger too in the late 90s and the turn of the century. Nowadays you might think of Atlanta as the mecca of rap, but it wasn't always like that. Thanks to labels like Rap-A-Lot Records, No Limit Records, and Cash Money Records, the South started to really make a name for itself, like the Bay Area and LA in the West, and Def Jam certainly wasn't looking to be left out of the picture. At this point, they had Original Black Records, Def Soul, Def Jam West, half of Rockefeller, and also Irv Gotti's Murder Inc. under the umbrella of Rush Associated labels. But by the turn of the century, they had become a part of the newly formed Universal Music Group, or UMG for short, due to being bought out. A label that signed record-breaking artists and put out such classic albums became a part of the machine, as they say. On the one hand, you can say it provided more funding, which is surely needed, but on the other hand, some might say that it was selling out. What side of the fence are you on? Anyways, that was Def Jam from its formation through the 90s. If you'd like to see a part 2 where we pick up with further releases from the classic artists as well as the rise of the South, make sure you click that like button, comment, vote in the polls, and remember to subscribe and become a channel member if you want to unlock certain perks and support the channel even further.